Hello guys! Today we're looking into one of my favorite films since I was a kid, the 95 epic Braveheart. Written by Randall Wallace and produced, directed and starred by Mel Gibson, Braveheart is described as a biopic of one of Scotland's most celebrated national heroes, William Wallace. But to be perfectly honest, a better description of Braveheart would be a medieval hack and slasher about how English people were wankers.
Some people hate the English, I don't. They're just wankers.
Now don't get me wrong, Braveheart is an excellent movie. The action is great, the acting is pretty solid, the cinematography is stunning, James Horner's soundtrack is unforgettable, and Mel Gibson's chiseled jawline is really on point. So on a technical level, Braveheart is a masterpiece and is the film that cemented Mel Gibson's place in Hollywood not only as a movie star but also as a talented filmmaker.
And the Oscar goes to Mel Gibson for Braveheart.
And look, I understand, this is a feature film, it's entertainment and not a history lesson. But Randall Wallace and Mel Gibson took the concept of artistic license so far here that Braveheart can barely be considered a biopic.
It's all lies, but they're entertaining lies. And in the end, isn't that the real truth? The answer is no.
Well, I guess we can be glad they at least didn't portray William Wallace as a monster hunter. Anyway, the main point I want to make in this video is that the filmmakers didn't embellish the tale of William Wallace only to make Braveheart a more entertaining film. The so-called historical inaccuracies are in fact part of the political message of Braveheart. And personally, I find it rather devious from artists when they use historical figures for propaganda this way. First, because it's a disservice to history, and second, because it plays into the larger cultural problem of the mythification of historical figures. Now, just an important disclaimer before we proceed, I will give major spoilers to Braveheart, so yeah, be advised of that. Okay, so Braveheart opens with a voiceover speech by Robert the Bruce, played by Angus MacFadden, alerting the audience that historians from England will say that the tale of William Wallace he's about to tell is a lie. But then he reminds us that history is written by tyrants.
I shall tell you of William Wallace. Historians from England will say I am a liar, but history is written by those who have hanged heroes.
Now this is a brilliant piece of screenwriting by Randall Wallace, who is not related to William, by the way. First, because, well, this is a really memorable quote. And second, because this is a very compelling way to convince the audience to question the authenticity of the official version of facts about William Wallace and the First War of Scottish Independence. After all, the cruel King of England did hang and quarter William Wallace for fighting for his country's independence. I told you I was gonna spoil it. But as profound and true as the words of Robert the Bruce may sound, they are also bullshit. I mean, there is some truth in the whole history is told by the winners proverb, but there is also historical evidence. And the evidence shows that many of the events depicted in Braveheart are complete fabrications. And the place for us to begin dissecting this film is looking at the way William Wallace's upbringing and family were portrayed. In Braveheart, we learn that William Wallace comes from a simple background. His father, Malcolm, played by Sean Lala, was a farmer who raised his two sons alone. Malcolm and his eldest son were murdered by the English when William was still a young boy, leaving him an orphan. William was adopted by the mysterious, badass Uncle Argyle, played by Brian Cox, who took him away and gave him education and military training. However, all of this is false. Well, to be fair to the filmmakers, little is known about William Wallace's childhood, and in 1995 it was indeed believed that William Wallace's father was a Malcolm Wallace, Laird of Elderslie, who had two sons. However, in 1999 new evidence confirmed that William Wallace's father was in fact an Alan Wallace, Crown Tenant of Ayrshire. Now in feudal lingo, Laird or Crown Tenant means a noble. Not a member of the upper nobility like Robert the Bruce, but still a feudal landlord who was able to live off rental income. And you all know how I feel about that. Therefore, William Wallace's education and military training, which led him to become a knight and military leader, were possible because his father had a decent income as a gentry. So even if we can cut the filmmakers some slack for making stuff up about Wallace's childhood due to lack of information, we can definitely say that the whole humble peasant childhood storyline is bullshit. Also, Wallace's father was alive in the year 1296, the year in which the First War of Scottish Independence broke out. That is known because both Alan Wallace of Ayrshire and Malcolm Wallace of Elderslie are among the 2,000 Scottish nobles who signed the Ragman Roll, and we need to talk about that. One thing Braveheart does to make its version of history more believable is to gloss over the political turmoil of late 13th century Scotland. There are basically two scenes in the entire movie where the political situation of Scotland is mentioned. The first one is during the introduction.
The King of Scotland had died without a son, and the King of England, a cruel pagan known as Edward the Longshanks, claimed the throne of Scotland for himself. Scotland's nobles fought him and fought each other over the crown.
And the second one is right after Wallace is knighted and named High Protector Guardian of Scotland. A group of men approaches Wallace and asks him to support the Balliol claim to the throne of Scotland, leading to a fight between the nobles.
Damn the Balliol clan!
William Wallace walks away and then says that instead of squabbling over titles, he will invade England and do what nobles should be doing, guarantee that the people of Scotland is free.
There's a difference between us. You think the people of this country exist to provide you with position. I think your position exists to provide those people with freedom.
Now, most of this is true, even though it's a gross simplification of history. After the King of Scotland, Alexander III, died in 1286, there was chaos in Scotland and numerous nobles started claiming the throne for themselves, a period known as the Great Cause. Now, during this period, Scotland was on the brink of a civil war, and to avoid war, many Scottish nobles asked for the King of England to intervene and help them choose a new King of the Scots. Now, being the diva that he was, Edward the Longshanks, played by Patrick McGoohan in Braveheart, said he would help them as long as he was recognized as Scotland's feudal overlord. The Scottish nobles agreed to hand over the throne of Scotland to Longshanks until a new king was chosen, and in 1292 John Balliol, who had the support of the Wallace clan, was chosen as the new king of the Scots. However, unfortunately for the Scots, the appointment of a new king didn't really make things better, because this John Balliol dude was a bit of a wimp. You see, during the process of selecting Balliol, the Scottish nobles conceded too much power to Longshanks, a power that Balliol was unable to reclaim. So by the end of this whole thing, the King of England remained as a de facto ruler of Scotland, with Balliol as his vassal, which explains why in that scene the Balliols are referred to as Longshanks' men. And as a ruler, Longshanks was indeed cruel, but not because he was a pagan, by the way, as Robert the Bruce says in the beginning of the film. Longshanks was actually a devout Christian, but more about that later. Now in 1294, England and France were at war for about the 1,012th time, and Longshanks demanded that the Scots send soldiers to help him defeat the French. In response, the Scottish nobles signed a military and diplomatic alliance with France in 1296, and as you can expect, Longshanks didn't like that very much.
The sheep! Mere sheep!
Now in Braveheart, Robert the Bruce tells us that Longshanks solved his rivalry with France by arranging a marriage between his son Edward II, played by Peter Hanley, with the French king's daughter Isabella, played by Sophie Morceau, which he kinda did. In 1299, 3 years after he invaded Scotland, France and England were not allies when the First War of Scottish Independence broke out, and in fact Longshanks saw the treaty between Scotland and France as an act of provocation and treachery, and that was the main motivation for him to invade and militarily occupy Scotland in 1296. It didn't take long for him to take control of many important Scottish towns and castles, and to consolidate his victory and dominion over Scotland, Longshanks demanded that the subjugated Scottish nobles, including an Alan Wallace of Ayrshire, William Wallace's father, and a Robert Bruce of Annandale, Robert the Bruce's father, played by Ian Bannon in Braveheart, to sign a document in which they swore a personal oath to the King of England, recognizing him as their overlord. This document became known as the Ragman Roll. So instead of this brave peasant who died when Wallace was still a boy, Alan Wallace was one of the disgraced nobles who pledged allegiance to Longshanks. However, William Wallace himself didn't sign the Ragman Roll. Instead, like a true Scotsman, he and Andrew Murray started a war against the English. So even though that scene in which Wallace scoffs at the Scottish nobles for squabbling over Longshanks' scraps is a fabrication, it does accurately represent the spirit of Wallace's rebellion against the English. However, the fact that Wallace's father was a noble who signed that infamous document remains, and that is a major inconvenience to the intent of the filmmakers. Wallace's father would be a source of shame instead of inspiration, so the filmmakers got rid of this problem by simply throwing history out the window and pretend that this Ragman Roll never existed.
Is this meant to be your shield, Lord Stark? A piece of paper.
Those were the king's words.
So, removing the nuances and complications of the Game of Thrones Scottish nobles were playing at the time made the Wallace clan look much more honourable and heroic than it actually was. But this oversimplification of history served a different purpose too, to make the English look more evil and one-dimensional. In fact, the English in this movie are so cartoonishly evil that I need an entire chapter to talk about that. In Braveheart, there isn't one single decent or relatable English character. They are shown as stupid, brutish, arrogant, cunning, debaucherous, sycophantic, coward, incompetent, or just plain evil.
Trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots.
They are basically the orcs from Lord of the Rings.
That he is an Englishman.
The only decent people in King Edward's court are the Princess of Wales and her courtier, who are both French. And not only the English nobles are evil, the English soldiers are equally bad. Now, for most of the film's running time, the soldiers are just brutally slain before they can even say a word, so we know nothing about them. But there is one sequence where the filmmakers gave us a little bit of insight on the average English soldiers stationed in Scotland during Longshanks' occupation. In the film's first act, William Wallace secretly marries a woman named Murron, played by Catherine McCormack. Now, they had to marry in secret to avoid the prima nocte, a law introduced by Longshanks that gave the English nobles in Scotland the right to rape Scottish women on the night of their wedding. This is made up, by the way. There is no historical evidence of such law being forced during Longshanks' occupation of Scotland. Anyway, an English soldier notices that Wallace and Murron are lovers, so he decides to claim his sexual rights over her. The charming soldier approaches Murron, tells her that she looks like his daughter back home in England, and then tries to rape her 2 minutes later. Real classic. And this is it. The only time in the entire film where we get to see an English soldier doing anything other than dying painfully. Now, after the attempted rape, Murron is captured and executed, and that is the primary motivation for Wallace to begin his rebellion. And before executing Murron, the sheriff gives a speech to make it very clear to anyone in the audience who wasn't paying attention that the nameless English soldier in this film aren't just regular folks following orders. No, no, no. Every single one of them is an extension of the evil king himself.
An assault on the king's soldiers is the same as an assault on the king himself.
Now, this whole sequence is very effective to desensitize the audience to the brutal violence against the English soldiers in this film. I mean, if they're just irredeemably evil rapist orcs, you won't feel anything in case the hero decides to decapitate one of them and serves his head to Lord Sauron on a silver platter. You think it's pretty cool, actually? I think it is. But desensitizing the audience isn't the only purpose of the orcization of the English in Braveheart. As with every major element of the film's narrative, the characterization of the antagonists serves a larger purpose.
It's all part of the plan.
And that's where the politics of Braveheart comes in. When looking at all of these narrative choices, the question we must ask is, why did the filmmakers make Braveheart the way they did? Why did it change history so much? Why did it make up characters and ignore the important real ones? Why did it portray the English as cartoonish pagan evildoers? Now, the reason is simple. It's because Braveheart isn't really about portraying the life of William Wallace or Scottish history. It's about creating a symbol and selling the audience a set of values and ideals, wrapping them all up in an action-packed adventure so the audience is sold on these values and ideals without even noticing it. And it's also about making Mel Gibson look good and make millions of dollars in the process, which they did. For example, in Braveheart, all upper-class people and politicians are selfish and corrupt. Well, except for Robert the Bruce, who gets a redemption arc. I mean, look at the Scottish nobles. Longshanks, who is literally Sauron, is pillaging Scottish towns and raping Scottish women, yet they make a deal with the guy only to maintain their privilege and titles. So of course, the only person who could not be corrupted according to the film's ethos was a peasant who had no titles or privilege. You see, at the heart of Braveheart,
Okay, I see what you did there.
there is a moral lesson about nobility.
You admire this man, this William Wallace. Uncompromising men are easier to admire. His courage, so does a dog. But it is exactly the ability to compromise that makes a man noble.
If you were a Scotsman, I'm ashamed to call myself one.
And what this story tells us is that the typical Christian values are those that make men noble. And those are the values that triumph in the end. Humility, austerity, devotion to God, patriotism, and self-sacrifice. William Wallace was captured, tortured, and murdered by the English in the end, but that didn't matter because his self-sacrifice and martyrdom were his final victory. And if that isn't clear enough, Braveheart makes his Christian message very clear right at the beginning of the film, when Robert the Bruce refers to Longshanks as a pagan king, as if a man capable of such cruelty could not be a devout Christian. On the surface, Braveheart seems like yet another Hollywood's anti-elitist and anti-imperialist propaganda film, which I approve. But once you dig a bit deeper, you find this Christian element more or less hidden in that, which I do not approve. So ultimately, Mel Gibson's film is populist Christian propaganda. The idea we are sold is that only a godly man of the people can be brave enough to surrender his body to torture and make the ultimate sacrifice for his countrymen. After killing dozens of people, of course, which makes William Wallace kinda like a crossover between Jesus Christ and the Punisher. However, in order to sell these values and ideals to the audience, the filmmakers had to lie. They had to create a version of William Wallace that is almost completely false.
That can't be William Wallace. I'm prettier than this man.
And they also created a version of Longshanks that is false. As we've seen, Longshanks was also betrayed by the Scottish nobility when he signed a treaty with France. Not that it justifies his imperialism, of course, but the Scots gave him reason to retaliate. And despite his ruthlessness, Longshanks made progressive changes in England, such as making the parliament a permanent institution. Historians see him as a very effective and competent king, and he was a devout Christian. The real Longshanks is evidence that a person can indeed be a believer of Jesus Christ while at the same time being capable of doing very cruel things. But there was another inconvenience that the filmmakers had to sweep under the proverbial rug. So they just called him a pagan and went on with it, because why not? But honestly, the filmmakers aren't the only ones to be blamed for this sort of vandalization of history. Braveheart screenwriter Randall Wallace has said that the main inspiration for his script was the poem The Wallace, written by Blind Harry in 1477. Harry's work is not contemporary to Wallace. It was written 172 years after William Wallace's death. It's based on folklore. It's not real history, but that's the story that was passed on generation after generation, and it is what people ended up believing. Because this is something that we do. We create these larger-than-life images of historical figures that are often caricatures of who they really were. We imagine kings, prophets, and martyrs as either superheroes or supervillains, but real life is never that simple. In the case of William Wallace, he was indeed a great Scot. Sorry, I just had to do it. He was a hero who inspired many people in his country to fight against a cruel tyrant. But he wasn't a mere peasant. If he was, he would have never done the things he did in his life. He would have never had the necessary education and training to do those things. And he didn't do it alone. Braveheart never mentions Andrew Murray, a man whose legacy is just as important and inspiring as William Wallace's. But unlike Wallace, who was a member of the lower nobility of Scotland, Murray was a member of the upper nobility. His family was very wealthy and had significant political influence. But Murray's legacy and sacrifice were completely erased from Braveheart because he's another historical inconvenience in the way of the filmmakers' propaganda. A harsh lesson from this story is that someone's social position often determines how much greatness they can achieve in life. And when we lie about historical figures to make them seem more humble than they really were, that lesson ends up forgotten, buried under myths and legends. But once you considered how Braveheart gave a major boost to the tourism industry in Scotland and how it helped reigniting the movement for Scottish independence, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people really need myths and legends to inspire them and give them hope.
Why didn't you tell them?
Because the myth of Jebediah has value too. It's brought out the best in everyone in this town. Regardless of who said it, a noble spirit embiggens the smallest man.
Well, thank you all for watching. If this is your first time here, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more content. Now, a big thanks to all of my subscribers and a massive ultra thank you to all of my lovely patrons. You know, I can't express into words all of my appreciation for your support during these difficult times. I really mean that, guys. You are the real legend. I've been Sarah Michel, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
I am William Wallace.
William Wallace is 7 feet tall.
Yes, I've heard. He kills men by the hundred. And if he were here, he'd consume the English with fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning from his arse.